Night collected itself around a small house like a blanket somebody folded with care, and in the quiet, a boy learned the difference between silence and listening. He lay awake beneath a ceiling that had once been white but now held the palest memory of summer smoke, and he listened as the dark hummed. Not the hum of fridges or distant traffic, a softer, older sound, like the faint lull of water under ice. Sometimes it spelled his name, or a name that felt close enough to be his. Sometimes it said nothing at all, and even that felt like family. He had a habit of counting breaths the way other kids counted marbles. 4 in, 6 out, pause. 4 in, 6 out, pause. The ceiling fan made a barely there shiver in the air, and the boy felt it across his skin like the easy brush of a hand that meant no harm. He took a chipped radio apart with a butter knife he'd stolen from the kitchen, placing the screws in a neat constellation on a napkin. Inside, the radio wasn't a puzzle. It was a sleeping animal that wanted to be coaxed awake. He put it back together with a small paper clip bent just so, and when he pressed the dial, the room filled with a soft hiss that sounded like night whispering secrets through a screen door. His mother had left a sandwich wrapped in wax paper on the counter. He unwrapped it quietly and ate half on the back steps, and for reasons he couldn't have explained, he kept the other half under his pillow. Maybe it was the idea of keeping a promise to himself. Maybe it was a talisman against bad dreams. When sleep finally took him, it didn't feel like falling. It felt like the night lifting him, 2 hands under the shoulders, warm and patient. Mornings were ordinary in an ordinary way. A mug with a crack that looked like a river delta. Shoes with the laces knotted together from the last time he'd gotten bored while thinking. School, where the lights were harsh and the air tasted like pencil dust. People asked him questions he had no interest in answering, not because he didn't know, but because the questions were small and the answers were smaller. He preferred the big questions that didn't want to be solved, only held. Why do stars feel closer when you close your eyes? Why does kindness feel like gravity when it's real? He learned quickly that he could bend his voice into the shape other people needed. If a teacher wanted crisp yeses, he offered crisp yeses. If a kid on the playground wanted a joke, he gave one, even if he didn't find it funny. A small power, not flashy, not loud, the art of stretching without breaking. In the hallway by the cafeteria, a girl cried into her locker door, silent and stubborn about it, a storm no one else noticed. He didn't say anything to her. He just stood beside her until the bell rang. She never thanked him, and he never expected it. That was the deal he made with himself, to be present without needing proof that it mattered. He learned that a person could be a lighthouse without announcing the light. One autumn afternoon, the school held a science fair. He built a tiny machine that purred when you touched it. Not a cat, but the faint suggestion of one. Not enough to impress, just enough to comfort. He set it on a table beside his name written in block letters and waited. Parents drifted past with the distracted eyes of people counting errands in their heads. His mother said she would come if the shift wraps early. Shifts rarely wrapped early. He kept his hands in his pockets and rocked back on his heels and told the device to be patient, the way you would tell a child to be patient if you loved them. When the winners were announced, he didn't win. He watched the janitor wheel a bucket that smelled like lemons into a corner. He stood beside his machine as the room emptied, and he told it a quiet truth. Not all absences are betrayals. Some are just the shape life makes when it's busy surviving. Still, that night the door to the kitchen closed softer than usual, and the softness hurt more than a slam would have. He lay there, awake, counting breaths and wondering why soft things could bruise. He took the purring machine from his backpack and set it beside him. The sound brushed against his ribs, a cat rubbing its head against a fence post. He thought of the girl at the locker and understood something without words. There are companions that are not people, and there are people who cannot be companions. It wasn't bitterness. It was a rearrangement of expectations, a gentle editing of the script. Years do what years always do. They peeled off and fluttered like calendar pages in a slow breeze, and the boy grew into a young man who wore the same thoughtful quiet the way others wore leather jackets. The house changed hands. New paint covered old summers, and then old summers bled through anyway, because that's what memories do when paint forgets to be thick. He kept building objects that listened more than they spoke. A clock that skipped the seconds everyone wasted worrying. A teapot that hissed when a lie was told in its vicinity, not loudly, not accusingly, just a little warning, like a kettle lifting the lid to peak. He fell in love once, or something like it. There were doorways of laughter and late-night sandwiches, and the kind of gaze that says, "I see where you're going before you do." But love is a long language, and both of them only knew the small talk. They cared, which was real, but care without fluency can become a maze. He learned how gently two people can lose each other, not with shouting, not with broken plates, just with days that forget to be held. The first time he held a child in his arms, the room smelled like warm blankets and an exhausted kind of happiness. The little boy's hand opened and closed in that slow, squidgy way newborns have, as if testing the viscosity of air. The young man hummed without thinking. Not a song exactly, more like a memory of a song. He'd heard through the radio static years ago. The infant settled. In that quiet, he felt a soft responsibility unspool inside him. Not to be perfect, not even to be present in every way, but to leave behind small tools that made being alive gentler. A lullaby, a device that purred, a way of making sandwiches that left room for someone else's hunger. Later, when the boy was older and the world had tilted toward neon, a grandfather existed, a man with a coat that smelled like solder and peppermint gum, a man whose pockets were full of screws that had escaped their jobs. He visited on evenings when the sky pressed its forehead against the windows and exhaled. He'd sit on the edge of the bed while the child fought sleep the way only children do, pretending exhaustion isn't already climbing his eyelids. The old man told stories that didn't know if they were dreams or memories, and the child listened with the whole body, as if listening were a sport he intended to excel at. There were clouds shaped like ships and stars that blinked in the pattern of a heartbeat, and doorways that opened only when someone spoke kindly to them. The boy did not understand the stories, not in the way adults mean understanding, but he felt the intention. He felt safe inside the shape of a voice that treated wonder as a steady thing. On nights when the house felt too big for its people, the old man would fix small things, a wobbly chair, a toy with a wheel stuck stubbornly sideways. He moved slowly, not to be dramatic about it, but because slow is how you show respect to an object that has tried hard for a long time. The boy watched the way a hand could say, "You did your best, let's try again." He learned the language of screws and patience. He learned that repair is a kind of forgiveness you can practice with your hands. There was a kitchen ritual that stayed, even as jobs shifted and calendars argued. Someone always left a sandwich on the counter. Sometimes it was cut into halves and wrapped like a gift. Sometimes it was a whole stack, uneven bread, a friendly mess. Whoever found it first ate a piece and left the rest, and no one complained if the ratio of eaten to left wasn't symmetrical. The sandwich became what families sometimes need when words are tired, proof that care doesn't require an audience. The old man took a bite one evening and smiled at the boy with his eyes half closed, as if to say, "This is how we say it without saying it." There were days when the old man disappeared for longer than felt comfortable. He returned with a new device in his pocket or a new silence in his mouth. The child didn't call it betrayal. He didn't have that kind of vocabulary. He only marked the days with pencil lines on the inside of a closet and noticed that some lines were longer. The old man, to his credit and his flaw, believed time could be stretched like warm taffy. He meant to make more of it for everyone, and sometimes only succeeded in thinning it for himself. In the soft arithmetic of a house like theirs, intent and outcome rarely equaled out, but the shape of the effort still counted. Once, during a thunderstorm that made the windows blink, the old man placed his purring machine on the nightstand. It had been with him since the fair, through moves and mistakes, through Saturday mornings when the sun came in loud. He rewired it with hands steadier than they looked. He pressed the casing closed and set it down. The device purred, not loud, not theatrical, and the boy's shoulders settled. Rain tapped the glass like someone politely asking to be let in. The old man whispered something that could have been advice or apology or both. The boy didn't catch the words, but he caught the meaning, which is what matters when you're half asleep. "I am trying. I am here when I can be. I want the nights to be kind to you." In that house, light behaved like a considerate guest. It didn't invade. It arrived. It slid across tabletops and paused at photographs and hid in the curve of a spoon. The boy grew into a kid who carried a flashlight without needing it, a talisman against the idea that he would ever have to walk through a hallway blind. The old man kept a notebook of small truths, the sort you learn by accident and then keep on purpose. On one page, he had written, "The first betrayal is often just a missed appointment with someone who needed you." On another, quieter page, he had written, "The antidote is presence in the moment you have." When the purring machine finally failed, it did so gently, during a nap. No smoke, no panic, just a last exhale, like a cat choosing a new windowsill somewhere none of them could reach. The old man took it apart in the kitchen under the soft cone of the lamp and showed the boy the tiny coil that had done so much for so long. The boy touched it with a reverent fingertip and said nothing. An absence acknowledged without drama can be a bridge instead of a cliff. And so the nights continued, and the house kept its quiet agreements with anyone willing to keep theirs. Somewhere between a snack left kindly and a repair done slowly, between a silence kept for someone else and a story told with care, a family wrote itself into being. Not perfect, not even tidy, but coherent in the way constellations are coherent. Dots that matter, because someone draws lines between them and says, "Look, that's us, right there, still making sense, even in the dark." Time, as it often does, began to lean forward, pressing the boy into the shape of someone older. The nights no longer felt like endless blankets spread across his imagination. They became measured, a little tighter, filled with obligations and thoughts that clung like damp cloth. Yet beneath it all, the soft rhythm of presence remained. Sandwiches left without words, repairs done in silence, the purring of machines that outlived their first purpose. Those quiet rituals formed the scaffolding of who he was, becoming, though he did not yet understand how much weight they carried. He noticed in small ways that he was different, not in the dazzling sense children sometimes crave, but in the subtle, hidden corners. While others hurried through hallways chasing noise, he walked with his attention spread wide, catching the faintest signs of a crack in someone's voice, or a heaviness in the way a friend's backpack drooped from one shoulder. He collected details the way some kids collected trading cards, not to show off, but because he couldn't help it. And when someone sat too long alone, he would drift near, offering his quiet company like a lantern that didn't need to be noticed to glow. At home, the house kept reshaping itself. Furniture shifted, wallpaper faded, and yet certain marks refused to leave. A faint dent in the banister where someone had leaned too often, a patch of floor that creaked like it had a story to tell. He had begun sketching these places in a notebook, not artistically, just as memory maps. Each drawing was simple, a window, a chair, a corner where dust clung stubbornly. He told himself he was practicing perspective, but truthfully he was afraid the house might one day be taken from him, painted over again, and he wanted to preserve its language before it forgot him. One winter evening, the old man came in later than usual, snow freckling his shoulders. He smelled faintly of engine grease and peppermint, the combination somehow comforting. The boy, now edging into his teenage years, looked up from his sketches as the door closed behind him. The old man dropped a small bundle onto the table, wires, gears, a casing that might once have been part of a clock, and said only, "It used to keep time, now it can keep memory." The boy tilted his head, confused, but the old man simply ruffled his hair and began to assemble the pieces. The machine took hours, built with patience rather than urgency. When it was done, it clicked faintly every time someone entered the room, as though recording the moment invisibly. The boy found it soothing, like proof that presence had weight. At school, life unfolded in the half-lit way adolescence often does. Friendships were elastic, stretching and snapping back. Words sometimes cut too deep, sometimes fell flat. He kept learning that kindness wasn't always returned, that people carried their own storms too heavy to notice lanterns nearby. Still, he refused to stop offering light. Once, when a classmate's project collapsed in front of everyone, laughter rang out like cruel bells. The boy bent down silently, helped gather the broken pieces and placed them back together on the table. His classmate didn't look at him, but their hands brushed briefly, and in that small contact lay a thank you neither had language for. The old man noticed these things without comment. He had always been a watcher more than a speaker, and now he watched the boy becoming the kind of person who understood that absence and presence are measured differently for each heart. On a night when the machine on the table clicked 3 times, 3 people entering in quick succession, the old man muttered something under his breath. "We betray each other by accident more often than we think." The boy caught the words, but not their full meaning. Still, he wrote them down in his notebook, beneath a sketch of the kitchen window. Time leaned further, as it always does, until the boy found himself taller, shoulders carrying the faint weight of expectation. His notebooks grew thicker, his machines more deliberate. He could now take apart an object and put it back together so seamlessly you might not notice the difference, except that it worked better than before. These creations weren't marvels. They were small, thoughtful corrections, devices that chose tenderness over spectacle. A lamp that dimmed itself when someone began to drift asleep. A box that released the faint scent of cinnamon when opened, no matter what was stored inside. Each invention was a gesture. Life could bruise you, yes, but it could also soothe you if given the right touch. The betrayal, though still only a shadow at this point, began to gather around the edges of his awareness. Nights when the old man was gone longer. Days when the sandwich was missing from the counter. Pauses in conversation where laughter used to slip in. Nothing dramatic, nothing sharp. Just silences that lingered a moment too long. The boy didn't name it, didn't even fully acknowledge it, but he felt it like a draft in an old house. He held onto his machines more tightly during those times, as though they were proof that someone once cared enough to leave him tools against loneliness. And yet, despite the cracks, warmth still lived in the corners. The old man returned with new stories, sometimes half-finished, sometimes nonsensical, but always delivered with a tenderness that made sense unnecessary. The boy still left half a sandwich under his pillow now and then, not because he was hungry, but because the ritual had become a private lullaby, one he sang to himself. He did not know it yet, but these patterns, the sandwiches, the machines, the sketches of forgotten corners, would become the scaffolding of his future. They would shape the way he carried both loyalty and hurt, the way he navigated the thin line between presence and absence, and they would teach him that even love, when stretched, could sometimes resemble betrayal. For now, though, the night remained gentle. The machines clicked softly in the dark. The notebook lay open on the desk with a half-finished drawing of the stairwell, and the boy drifted towards sleep. In his dream, he walked through the house, each room lit by the glow of a lantern he had not lit himself. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the reach of his understanding, a voice hummed, not calling, not explaining, only existing, steady as a tide. Morning light stretched across the boy's room, not in sudden brightness, but in long, careful strokes, as if the day itself wanted to arrive quietly. He sat at his desk with the notebook open, tracing the lines he had drawn the night before. The stairwell, the banister, the familiar dent. His pencil hovered above the page, uncertain whether to add more detail or to leave it unfinished, as though the incompleteness itself carried its own truth. He closed the book softly, almost reverently, and leaned back, letting the quiet breathe around him. The house had its rhythms, and he had grown attuned to them. The faint groan of the pipes in the walls when someone turned on a tap, the soft scuff of shoes by the front door, the low click of the memory machine when footsteps entered the kitchen. These were not just sounds, but reassurances, proof that presence still existed, even if words sometimes failed. He carried them with him the way others carried music, a background melody that guided his days. School was becoming more demanding, the sort of demanding that filled hours with tasks, yet left the heart strangely empty. Lessons stacked on top of one another until they blurred, and still he found himself drawn to the spaces between, the pause after a question, the flicker of hesitation before someone laughed, the way loneliness wore disguises no one else seemed to notice. He wasn't celebrated for these observations, nor did he expect to be. What mattered was that he kept them, tucked away in the quiet corners of his mind, like pressed flowers between the pages of an unseen book. One afternoon, during a long walk home, he saw the old man standing at the edge of the street, shoulders bent against the cold wind. He held a bundle of tools under his arm, as though even errands required companions. The boy slowed his pace, watching the figure from a distance, feeling both affection and something more complicated, a tug of longing mixed with unease. When their eyes met, the old man smiled, but it was a tired smile, the kind that had to travel a long way before it reached the mouth. They walked home together in silence, their steps finding a rhythm, 2 beats against the pavement, like an unfinished song. That evening, the old man showed him a new device. It was small, no larger than a matchbox, but its purpose was strange. "It listens," he said, placing it on the table. "Not to words, not exactly. More to intention." He didn't explain further, but the boy noticed that whenever someone entered the room carrying worry, the box released a faint hum, low and steady. When the air was light with laughter, the hum disappeared, as if the machine had nothing to hold. The boy pressed his ear close, hearing not just the sound but the promise beneath it, that emotions could be acknowledged without being spoken aloud. Nights grew heavier as winter deepened. Sometimes the house felt too quiet, like a story missing its middle. The boy lay awake, counting breaths again, 4 in, 6 out, trying to anchor himself in the ritual. He thought of the sandwiches, the lantern-like presence of small gestures, and wondered if they were strong enough to carry him through the growing silences. His machines, the purring device, the clicking recorder, the humming box, seemed to take turns reminding him that someone had once believed care could be built, piece by piece. Yet he sensed the edges fraying, the spaces between presence and absence widening ever so slightly, and it made him hold tighter to what still remained. The old man disappeared for several days, longer than before. The boy marked the lines again inside the closet, longer strokes this time, his hand pressing harder into the wood. When the old man finally returned, his coat smelled of smoke and rain, and his eyes carried shadows. He placed a broken watch on the table and began to repair it without speaking. The boy sat across from him, not asking questions, simply watching the careful movements of his hands. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile, more like the silence of 2 people aware that words would not be enough. That night, the boy dreamt of the house again, but this time the lanterns flickered. Some rooms were dimmer than others, some corners harder to reach. He walked slowly through the dream, touching the walls, whispering promises he hoped would hold. When he woke, he felt a quiet determination settle in his chest, to keep the light alive, even when others forgot to tend it. Days blurred into one another, but he began to notice a pattern. The betrayals were not loud, not sharp. They were small, a promise made and then delayed, a glance that slid past instead of meeting his eyes, an absence at the dinner table explained away by work. He did not call them betrayals yet, not openly, but his heart knew. And still, he stayed, sketching corners, repairing machines, holding on to rituals. Because to him, love was not measured in perfection, but in persistence. The boy was growing, and with growth came the recognition that presence could not always be counted on, that even those who loved you could falter. Yet instead of hardening, he chose to soften further, to stretch into the spaces left empty. If there was silence, he filled it with patience. If there was absence, he filled it with memory. If there was betrayal waiting at the edges, he carried it gently, hoping that one day it too might soften into forgiveness. The house exhaled as spring approached. The pipes groaned less. Light returned earlier in the mornings, and though the old man's absences still came, though the sandwiches sometimes failed to appear, the boy continued his rituals. He knew, without naming it, that these rituals were not just habits, they were anchors. They were the threads tying him to something larger than himself, even if that larger thing was frayed. And somewhere in the quiet, beneath all the unfinished conversations and unspoken apologies, the boy began to understand. The story of a family is not told only in presence. It is told equally in absence, in what is missing, in what is left unsaid but still felt. It is told in the soft hum of a machine that listens, the faint purr of something broken but loyal, the quiet decision to keep walking forward, even when the lantern light flickers. The days lengthened, stretching into afternoons where sunlight lingered on the window glass as if reluctant to leave. The boy, now tall enough to see his reflection in places he hadn't before, carried his notebook everywhere. The sketches grew more intricate, not only corners of the house but also faces, hands, and the faint curves of expressions that passed too quickly for others to notice. Each page was a record, not of facts, but of feelings, the way laughter bent the mouth into shapes of survival, the way silence pressed into shoulders until they rounded. He didn't share the drawings with anyone. They weren't for proof. They were reminders that he had seen, that he had paid attention. The old man watched from the side, his eyes shadowed with something the boy had begun to recognize as regret. He repaired what he could, but it was always small things. A snapped shoelace, a toy abandoned too early, a light bulb flickering at the end of its life. These repairs mattered, yet the boy understood, though not fully, that they were also distractions. The bigger fractures, the long absences, the quiet promises left hanging, were harder to mend. Sometimes the old man's hands trembled as he tightened a screw, and the boy felt an ache he couldn't name. It was not disappointment, not exactly, but a sorrow that the lantern light seemed dimmer, flickering where it had once been steady. One evening, while sorting through the machines on his desk, he found the little humming box silent. He tapped it, checked its wires, rewound the coil, but it gave no sound. He realized with a sudden pang that no one had been carrying worry into the room lately. Instead, they had carried absence, and absence had no sound to record. He placed the box back on the table and left it there, a silent witness to the silence itself. At school, the currents of friendship shifted again. A boy he had trusted stopped sitting beside him at lunch. A girl he had quietly admired laughed at something he said, but it wasn't kind laughter. It was sharp. He learned how fragile loyalty could be, how easily bonds bent under the weight of misunderstanding. Yet even then, he didn't harden. He carried sandwiches in his bag and offered them to anyone who sat near, even strangers. Most refused. Some accepted. To him, the act was enough, even if the hunger was not there. The old man noticed his patience but didn't comment. Instead, he brought home a small telescope, scratched and second-hand, and set it by the boy's window. "For nights when you need company," he said, almost too quietly to hear. Through it, the boy looked at the stars, faint and stubborn, scattered like the screws on his napkin from years before. He found constellations no one had named, lines only he could draw, stories only he could tell. He whispered to them as if they might whisper back, and in that habit he felt less alone. But the silences at home thickened. Sometimes days passed without a sandwich on the counter. Sometimes the door closed with no explanation, and when it opened again, the old man carried new shadows in his coat. The boy didn't accuse, didn't even ask, but he marked the absence in his notebook alongside his sketches. A simple line, drawn firm. Each line was a quiet acknowledgement. Something promised, something missing. He didn't yet call it betrayal, but the word waited, patient, at the edges of his mind. One night, after another long absence, the old man sat across from him, exhausted, his hands trembling too much to fix anything. "You'll understand one day," he murmured, staring at the tabletop, as though answers might be carved into the wood. The boy wanted to ask, understand what? But he held his tongue. Questions sometimes broke fragile things, and he didn't want to risk it. Instead, he opened his notebook and sketched the old man's hands, trembling, scarred, and beautiful in their persistence. He did not show him, but the drawing felt like a vow to remember, even when memory hurt. Sleep came late that night, but when it came, it carried a dream so vivid he woke with his heart racing. He dreamt of the house again, but this time it was not lit by lanterns. Instead, the stars themselves had moved inside, resting in corners, perched on shelves, flickering softly like candles. Each star pulsed with presence, but when he reached out to touch them, some dimmed, some vanished altogether. He woke before dawn, the dream pressing against his chest like a secret too heavy to ignore. He wrote it down, not just in sketches, but in words. Light cannot be borrowed forever. It must be tended, or it leaves. The boy rose with the morning, quieter than usual. He fixed himself breakfast, wrapped a sandwich carefully and placed it on the counter, as though offering the ritual back to the house. He did not know if anyone would take it, but the gesture was enough to steady him. For the first time, he felt that the responsibility of presence might shift, that perhaps he could become the one to leave lanterns glowing for others, even when their hands trembled too much to strike the match. And so, the rhythm of the house continued, stitched together with rituals fragile but persistent. Yet beneath it, the undertow of betrayal grew stronger, silent but steady. The boy could feel it in the way his sketches grew darker, in the way his machines hummed less brightly, in the way silence pressed heavier against the walls. He carried it without protest, but he knew, though he did not say, that something was changing, and it would not change back. The sandwich he left on the counter that morning remained untouched by noon. He noticed it as he walked through the kitchen, its wax paper slightly curled at the edges, the bread softening under the weight of time. It struck him with a quiet ache, not because the food had gone uneaten, but because the gesture itself had not been received. Presence, he was beginning to realize, required two ends of a thread. If one hand let go, the string sagged, and no matter how tightly he held his side, the shape of it changed. He picked it up carefully, unwrapped it, and ate in silence, not wasting what was still whole, even if the ritual had failed. The old man returned late that night, shoulders hunched against the cold, his eyes refusing to meet the boy's. He carried a tool bag heavier than usual, clinking with odd fragments that made no sense together. He placed it on the table and began sorting the pieces without a word. The boy watched him from across the room, waiting for the small warmth that usually came after an absence, a story, a half smile, a touch on the shoulder. But it didn't come. The air between them thickened, not with anger, but with distance, like fog settling in a valley. The boy opened his notebook, sketched the curve of the old man's bent back, and shut it quickly, as though afraid the drawing might expose too much truth. The days followed this pattern, absences that stretched longer, returns that carried fewer words. The boy filled the space with his machines, building not for applause or recognition, but for comfort. He made a small box that clicked gently every hour, a reminder that time could still be measured when promises could not. He made a lamp that warmed the air even before the bulb lit, as if anticipating someone's need for light. Each creation soothed him in ways conversation no longer did, though beneath the rhythm of invention he felt the quiet sting of disappointment. At school, he found himself retreating further. Friends came and went, laughter rose and fell, but his focus drifted inward. He began to notice how betrayal did not always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it wore the disguise of indifference. Sometimes it was the failure to notice, the silence where reassurance should have been. He carried that understanding with him like a stone in his pocket, heavy but grounding. When a classmate forgot his name, when another promised to meet him but never came, he simply nodded, accepting the small betrayals as part of life's texture. Yet each one pressed against the larger ache, the one waiting at home. One evening, after another day of silence, he found the old man asleep at the table, his head resting against folded arms. The tools lay scattered around him, unfinished repairs abandoned. The boy stood for a long moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his breath. He wanted to wake him, to ask where he went during those long absences, to demand answers he had been too patient to request. But instead he covered him with a blanket, gathered the tools and placed them neatly aside. He whispered a single word, "Stay." Though he knew the sleeping figure couldn't hear, it was less a request than a prayer, fragile and unlikely. That night he dreamt again of the house filled with stars, but now some rooms were completely dark. He wandered through, lantern in hand, trying to coax the light back, but the stars that had gone out did not return. The silence of those rooms was overwhelming, pressing against his chest until he could hardly breathe. He woke with his fists clenched around the sheets, sweat cooling on his forehead, and the ache of the dream lingering long after the dawn arrived. The following morning he prepared another sandwich and left it on the counter, though a part of him knew it would go untouched again. He did it not out of hope, but out of defiance, a refusal to let go of the ritual that had once bound them together. He left for school, walking slower than usual, feeling the weight of that small gesture behind him. When he returned, the sandwich was gone. No note, no word, just absence where the food had been. For a brief moment, his chest lifted, the thread tightening again, faint but still there. It was in those fragile moments that he understood something essential. Family was not built only on presence, but on the choice to keep showing up even when presence faltered. Betrayal, too, was not always a rupture. Sometimes it was a thinning, a stretching so subtle it could be mistaken for space. And yet, despite it all, he held the thread with both hands, refusing to let it drop. Evenings stretched longer. The machines clicked, hummed and purred softly around him, filling the silence with a music of his own making. And though the old man's returns carried fewer stories and more shadows, the boy remained, sketching, inventing, and leaving sandwiches on the counter, each one a quiet reminder that he was still here, waiting for the lanterns to glow again. The sandwich gone from the counter that day lingered in his thoughts far longer than it should have. Not because of the food itself, but because it proved something he had nearly stopped believing, that the ritual still meant something, even if no one admitted it aloud. That quiet act of disappearance became its own kind of dialogue, a softer language between them. It was not forgiveness, not closeness, but it was recognition, and the boy clung to it like a thread pulled taut between two distant poles. Yet the relief did not last. Days followed when the counter remained bare, and the silence returned heavier than before. The boy found himself listening more closely to the machines that filled his room. Their clicks, hums, and low vibrations became companions, each sound a reminder that something in the world still responded when touched. He began to build with greater focus, as though his hands carried the responsibility of keeping presence alive. One device measured nothing but warmth, glowing faintly whenever a hand hovered near. Another whispered a soft tone at random intervals, like a lullaby that refused to forget its melody. He surrounded himself with these inventions, and still the ache remained, a hollow space machines could not fill. The old man noticed the creations scattered across the room one evening and stood in the doorway longer than usual. His eyes softened, but he said nothing. Words had grown scarce between them, replaced with glances that carried more weight than they used to. The boy wanted to ask why the absences stretched so wide, why the silences pressed so hard, but the question stayed locked behind his teeth. He had learned by now that asking would not change the answer. The old man left again soon after, his footsteps fading into the night. The boy watched him go from the window, a small figure swallowed by darkness, and felt the familiar heaviness settle into his chest. He turned back to his machines, winding a coil, tightening a screw, but the work no longer soothed him as it once had. This time the silence felt heavier than the sound of absence could explain. At school the following day he drifted through conversations without truly being present. Friends spoke of trivial things, laughter echoing in corners, and he smiled when expected, nodded when required, but inside he was tracing the pattern of absence again. Betrayal, he realized, was not always in the breaking of promises. Sometimes it was in the weight of what went unsaid, the slow erosion of trust that no one wanted to name. He carried that thought with him like a stone, heavy and unpolished, filling the space in his pocket where his hands often rested. When he returned home that evening, the counter was empty. No sandwich, no note, only the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the air. He unwrapped his own bread, ate in silence, and left the other half under his pillow, a ritual clinging stubbornly to its meaning. In the night, he dreamt of the stars again. They had grown dimmer, more distant. He reached for them, lantern in hand, but found only outlines fading into the dark. He whispered promises, but the stars did not answer, and the silence followed him even into waking. The next morning, the boy found the old man asleep in the chair by the window, his head tilted, his breathing uneven. The light caught in the lines of his face, carving shadows deeper than before. The boy watched him for a long time, torn between tenderness and hurt. He wanted to reach out, to shake him awake, to demand presence, but instead he pulled a blanket over his shoulders and walked quietly away. His notebook lay open on the desk, and he added another drawing, not of the house this time, but of the old man himself, sleeping under the pale light of morning. Beneath the sketch he wrote, "Love sometimes looks like waiting too long." He carried that thought with him through the day, and it changed the way he moved. He noticed the small betrayals in others more keenly, the friend who forgot his story halfway through, the teacher who overlooked his raised hand, the stranger on the bus who turned away instead of answering a smile. These moments echoed louder now, because they mirrored the one waiting at home. Each absence, each silence pressed against him like waves against a shore, reshaping the edges of who he was becoming. Yet even as the weight grew, he did not let go of the thread. Each night he left something small, a sandwich, a note, a repaired object on the table, and each morning he checked to see whether it remained. Sometimes it disappeared, sometimes it did not, but the ritual continued. Because persistence, he believed, was its own form of presence, even if it was unreturned. The house seemed to understand, holding him in its familiar creaks and groans, its pipes humming softly in the dark. And though the stars in his dreams dimmed, he kept carrying the lantern, convinced that even a flickering light could still guide him forward. The rituals continued, though each one felt a little thinner, stretched as though the thread between them could fray at any moment. Some mornings the sandwich was gone, and those days felt like small victories, a quiet exchange no one spoke of, but both seemed to understand. Other mornings it remained untouched, and the boy would unwrap it slowly, eat it alone, and pretend that this too was a kind of dialogue. One-sided, but still better than nothing. He told himself that persistence was love, that carrying the thread was enough, but in the spaces between gestures, he began to sense the weight of imbalance. The machines in his room became his true companions. Each had its own voice, its own way of filling the silence. The purring box still worked on occasion, though its hum was weaker now, fading in and out like a heartbeat too tired to keep time. The clicking recorder still marked footsteps, though more often it clicked once alone, and then waited hours before the next sound. He built a new device, one that glowed faintly whenever someone stood near it, a soft sphere of light meant to prove that presence could be measured, even if unspoken. He kept it on his desk at night, watching the glow falter whenever the room grew empty. The old man noticed the new creation once, paused at the doorway, and gave the faintest smile. It lasted only a moment before he turned away, as if even acknowledgement had become too heavy to hold. The boy saw it nonetheless and recorded it in his notebook, a sketch of the glow, a faint smile beside it, and the caption, "Even small lights count." But the absences lengthened. Sometimes the old man left before dawn and returned after midnight, so weary he said nothing at all. Sometimes days passed with no sign of him, and the boy marked the lines on the closet wall again, each stroke darker than the last. He began to feel the truth pressing in, that holding the thread alone could not keep it from slipping. No matter how carefully he sketched, how patiently he invented, how faithfully he left the sandwich on the counter, presence required two hands. Without the old man's, the thread was beginning to unravel. This realization came slowly, not with a sudden break, but with the steady erosion of hope. One night, he left the sandwich as always, but this time he added a note. "You are not alone." He folded it under the wax paper, placed it neatly on the counter, and went to bed. In the morning, the sandwich was gone, but the note was left behind, unfolded, resting on the table as though it had been seen but not taken to heart. He stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters he had written, wondering if words could ever reach across silence. At school, he began to feel the same ache. Friends laughed without him. Conversations passed like rivers he couldn't step into. He gave small kindnesses, lending a pencil, holding open a door, listening when no one else would, but they rarely lingered. People accepted, smiled, and moved on, leaving him with the same weight he carried at home. Betrayal, he understood more clearly now, was not always intentional. Sometimes it was simply the failure to notice, the quiet choice to look away when someone needed to be seen. The boy walked home slower these days, dragging his feet through the fading light. The house welcomed him with its familiar creaks, but even those sounded emptier now. He sat at his desk, notebook open, machines glowing softly around him, and wrote a sentence across a blank page. Presence should not feel like begging. He read it aloud, softly, as though testing the truth of it, and the room answered only with silence. That night he dreamed of the stars again. More of them had gone out, leaving only a handful flickering faintly in the corners of the dream house. He carried his lantern carefully, guarding the flame, but the dark pressed closer, thicker, more insistent. He woke with his heart tight in his chest, his throat dry, and the faint glow of his new device dimming at the edge of the desk. For the first time, he wondered if carrying the lantern alone was enough, or if its light would eventually fade with him. Still, he rose in the morning and left another sandwich on the counter. Because persistence was the only language he knew, and he was not ready to abandon it. Yet in the quiet of his chest, he felt the first cracks forming, the first understanding that loyalty without balance could become its own kind of betrayal. And though he would not admit it, even to himself, he knew the story of the house and its rituals was shifting. The thread he held so tightly was slipping, and his hands were beginning to ache from the strain. The mornings grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into the quiet spaces between rituals and lingers, even when the sun rises. He continued leaving the sandwich on the counter, but each time he did, his hands trembled slightly, as though the act itself had become heavier than before. Sometimes it was taken, sometimes left behind, and the unpredictability wore on him. What once felt like proof of connection now felt like a gamble, and each untouched sandwich was a reminder that presence could be chosen or refused. The machines offered no answers. They glowed and clicked and purred as faithfully as ever, but their constancy only emphasized the unevenness elsewhere. He sat by them at night, listening to their small sounds, and felt an ache grow inside him, the ache of something he could not repair. Wires and gears bent to patience. Absence did not. He wrote more often in his notebook, words now crowding the pages alongside sketches. How long can one person hold the thread before it unravels completely? Does silence become betrayal if it lasts too long? His handwriting grew darker, pressing harder into the paper, as though force might keep the questions from dissolving into air. The old man returned one evening with a limp in his step, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. He set his bag on the floor and lowered himself into a chair without speaking. The boy, standing nearby, waited for something. Any small gesture, a smile, a story, even a glance, but none came. The silence pressed until the boy's chest hurt. He wanted to shout, to demand why the thread kept slipping, but the words stayed locked in his throat. Instead, he fetched a blanket, draped it gently over the old man's shoulders, and whispered, almost without breath, "I'm still here." The old man stirred faintly but did not respond, and that lack of response carried more weight than words ever could. Sleep came late again, filled with dreams that mirrored his waking fears. The stars in the dream house continued to go out, one after another, until whole rooms lay swallowed in darkness. His lantern flickered, its flame weaker than before, and though he tried to shield it with his hands, the dark pushed closer. He woke, gasping, clutching at his sheets, and stared at the dim glow of his desk lamp until his breathing steadied. The dream felt less like imagination, and more like warning. The following morning he didn't prepare a sandwich right away. He lingered at the counter, staring at the empty surface, questioning the ritual itself. Was persistence still proof of love, or had it become desperation? He finally unwrapped the bread, spread it carefully, and left it there. But this time the gesture felt different. Not a vow, but a test. All day he thought of it, wondering whether it would remain, and when he returned home, he found the sandwich gone. Relief washed through him, but it was thin, quickly swallowed by the realization that even when the ritual succeeded, it no longer healed the silence between them. At school, the same patterns repeated. He gave kindnesses freely, and they were accepted without recognition, leaving him with the echo of gestures returned only half-formed. He began to see how absence spread, like a shadow touching every corner of his life. It was not confined to the house or the old man. It followed him into every hallway, every conversation, every moment where presence should have lived. Still, he held the thread, because letting go felt unthinkable, even as his hands grew sore from gripping it so tightly. One evening, when the house was quieter than usual, he opened his notebook and wrote across an entire page, "Love without response becomes endurance." He stared at the sentence for a long time, the truth of it pressing into him like a weight he could no longer ignore. He closed the notebook slowly, placed it beside the glowing sphere on his desk, and lay down with his eyes open to the ceiling. The machines hummed around him, steady as ever, but even their constancy could not soften the feeling that he was carrying too much alone. And in that heavy silence he began to understand that holding on forever was not the same as being held. The thought unsettled him, fragile and dangerous, but it lingered, waiting for the moment when it would no longer be denied. The thought that holding on forever was not the same as being held did not leave him. It echoed through the days, quiet but persistent, like a faint hum beneath every sound. He carried it with him to school, through the shifting tide of conversations, and home again to the silent counters and machines that waited faithfully. It began to change the way he moved, the way he noticed things. Where before he had seen absence as something to endure, he now saw it as something that marked him, carved small hollows into his days that no persistence could quite fill. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone still. The counter was empty. He had not left a sandwich that morning, choosing instead to wait and see what absence would say for itself. The silence answered, louder than he expected. He opened his notebook, meaning to sketch the shadowed corners of the room, but instead he wrote words, heavy and deliberate. If I stop, does everything stop? The sentence hung on the page, uncomfortably bare, and he found himself staring at it until his eyes blurred. When the old man returned that night, his steps were heavier than usual, dragging with fatigue. He moved through the kitchen without looking at the boy, without noticing the notebook open on the table, and poured himself a glass of water. The boy waited, watching for the smallest sign, a glance, a word, even the faintest acknowledgement. But none came. Something inside him shifted then, subtle but certain. He realized the thread he had been holding so tightly was not only fraying, it was slipping beyond his reach. Sleep did not come easily. He lay awake, listening to the faint hums of his machines, but even they seemed distant, muffled by the weight in his chest. When dreams finally took him, they were darker than before. The house appeared again, but now only one star flickered faintly in a single room. He carried his lantern carefully, shielding it with his hands, but the flame trembled, weaker than ever. As he moved closer to the last star, it blinked once, twice, and went out. The darkness swallowed him whole, and he woke gasping, his body tense as though he had been running. The next morning, he did not make a sandwich. He walked through the kitchen, past the counter, and felt both guilt and relief in the act of omission. It was a quiet rebellion, so small no one else would notice, but to him it felt like breaking a rule carved deep into his bones. He left the house with empty hands, wondering if absence might finally reveal its shape when mirrored back. At school, he felt strangely detached, as if he were moving through someone else's day. He smiled when spoken to, gave small kindnesses out of habit, but inside he was measuring silence. Each unanswered gesture, each unreturned glance, seemed to echo the same truth as the counter at home. Threads cannot be carried by one hand forever. By the time he walked back through the door that evening, the decision to withhold the ritual had settled in him like a stone, heavy but oddly grounding. The old man was already there, sitting at the table with tools scattered around him. He looked up briefly, his eyes passing over the boy before lowering again. No words were spoken. The boy stood in the doorway, watching, waiting for the spark of recognition, but none came. He wanted to ask if the absence had been noticed, if the silence tasted different without a sandwich waiting to be claimed, but the question never left his lips. He walked past, into his room, and shut the door softly behind him. There, surrounded by the steady hums of his machines, he opened the notebook once more. He sketched the counter, the table, the empty space where the sandwich should have been. Underneath he wrote, "Sometimes absence is louder than presence." The words settled like a truth he could no longer ignore. He stared at them until the light outside faded, and when he finally closed the book, he felt a shift inside him, small but irreversible. The machines clicked and purred, faithful as ever, but even their constancy could not quiet the realization forming within him. If love had become endurance, and endurance had become silence. Then something would have to break. He wasn't sure if it would be the thread, the lantern, or himself, but he knew the story was moving toward a moment where nothing could remain as it was. The realization that something would have to break stayed with him, threading itself through every moment of the days that followed. It sat quietly behind his thoughts at school, followed him down hallways, lingered at the edges of conversations. Each kindness he offered felt thinner, stretched by the weight of knowing it might never return. At home, the house carried on with its familiar creaks and sighs, but even those sounds now felt like echoes of a story that was slowly unraveling. He noticed how the old man's footsteps grew heavier, how his silences deepened, how his hands sometimes shook when he tried to fix even the simplest things. Once, the boy might have stepped forward, quietly taking over the repair, easing the burden with his patience. Now he watched instead, torn between tenderness and resentment, wanting to help but unwilling to erase the truth that effort was missing from places where it mattered most. The thread they shared was still there, but it was fraying so visibly that even pretending could no longer hide it. One night, he left the counter bare again, testing whether absence would finally demand to be acknowledged. When morning came, the old man sat at the table, a half-empty cup of coffee beside him, staring at nothing. The boy hovered in the doorway waiting, hoping for a question, even a glance that meant the missing ritual had been felt. But no words came. The silence answered louder than any confrontation could, and the boy turned away, his chest tight with something heavier than anger. That evening he carried his notebook outside for the first time. He sat on the steps beneath the bruised colours of sunset and opened to a blank page. He drew the house, but this time he didn't fill it with corners and details. He sketched it hollow, its windows empty, its door ajar, as though the walls themselves had forgotten how to hold. Underneath he wrote, "What if the house is only standing because I refuse to let it fall?" The words frightened him, but they also felt true, more than anything else he had written. The machines continued to hum and glow faithfully in his room, but he no longer looked to them for comfort. Their constancy now reminded him of what was missing, of what could not be built with wires and light. He began spending more time with his notebook, writing in sentences instead of sketches, letting the words carry the weight that rituals no longer could. Each line grew darker, sharper, as though he were chiseling truths into the paper rather than writing them. The dreams returned, darker still. The house of stars stood again, but this time his lantern flame was nearly gone, a faint flicker against an ocean of dark. He walked from room to room, searching for light, but each door he opened revealed only shadow. In the final room he found the old man seated at a table, his head bowed, hands motionless. The boy tried to speak, to call out, but no sound came. The lantern dimmed once, twice, then extinguished completely. He woke with tears on his face, the image of the darkened house clinging to him like a warning. The next morning he sat at the counter with bread in his hands, the familiar ingredients waiting in silence. He stared at them for a long time, unsure whether to continue the ritual or let it end. His hands moved automatically, spreading, folding, wrapping, as though the act was stitched into his muscles. He placed the sandwich on the counter but did not walk away. Instead he waited. Hours passed, and still he sat there, watching, until the old man finally entered. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment the boy saw exhaustion, regret, and something unspoken flicker across the old man's face. But just as quickly, it was gone. The old man picked up the sandwich without a word, unwrapped it, and ate slowly, his gaze fixed on the table. The boy remained seated, silent, watching, feeling both relief and hollowness at once. Presence had returned in form, but not in spirit. When the last bite was gone, the old man rose and left the room, leaving behind only the faint rustle of wax paper. The boy stayed at the counter, staring at the empty space where the sandwich had been, and realized that persistence alone could not save what was slipping away. The thread was breaking, and this time he could feel it pulling loose from both ends. He opened his notebook that night and wrote a single sentence across the page. "When the lantern goes out, you cannot pretend the dark is light." The words felt final, like the closing of a door, and as he laid the pencil down, He understood that the story he had been carrying was nearing a turning point that persistence alone could not hold back. The sentence he had written stayed open on his desk for days, the graphite pressed deep into the paper, darker than any sketch he had made before. He found himself reading it over and over, as though the words had been written not by his own hand, but by something inside him he had finally stopped resisting. Each time he traced the letters with his eyes, the truth sank deeper. The lantern had dimmed, and pretending otherwise was only another silence stacked upon silence. The house felt different now, though nothing had changed visibly. The walls still carried their familiar creaks, the pipes still hummed, the floorboards still bent slightly under weight. But the air itself seemed thinner, as if the house had grown tired of holding two people who barely reached for each other anymore. He walked its halls slowly, notebook in hand, capturing corners not out of nostalgia but out of farewell, as though he were archiving proof of what was slipping beyond repair. The old man continued his pattern, leaving, returning, sitting in silence at the table. Sometimes he ate what was left for him, sometimes he didn't, and the boy began to understand that the sandwich no longer carried meaning on its own. It had become a habit, stripped of its warmth like a clock ticking in an empty room. And though he kept making them, more out of muscle memory than hope, each one left him feeling more hollow than the last. One evening he lingered by the kitchen doorway, watching the old man fiddle with a broken radio. The man's hands moved with the same practiced patience as always, but his eyes were somewhere else, distant, unfocused. The boy felt a surge of questions rise within him. Why do you leave? Why don't you see me? Why does silence speak louder than you do? But none of them found their way out. His throat tightened, and he turned away before the words could betray his patience. That night the dream returned, sharper, colder. He walked again through the star house, lantern in hand, its flame a faint shimmer against the endless dark. This time, when he entered the final room, the table was empty. No figure sat waiting, no shadow bent in silence. Only the chair remained, pushed slightly askew, and the boy felt the dark press closer, thicker, until it seemed to seep into his skin. He woke with a start, breath ragged, and for the first time he did not reach for his machines. Their hum felt useless against the weight of what he had seen. The following morning he sat at the counter with bread and wax paper before him, but his hands did not move. He stared at the ingredients, waiting for the ritual to demand itself from him, but nothing came. The absence no longer felt like rebellion or test, it felt like inevitability. He closed his hands, pushed the bread aside, and left the counter bare. When the old man came home that night and glanced toward the empty surface, his face showed nothing. No recognition, no disappointment, only the same distance as before. That lack of response told the boy more than any words could have. He returned to his room, closed the door, and opened his notebook once more. This time he didn't sketch the house or write a question. He wrote a statement, careful and deliberate. The thread is breaking, and I cannot hold both ends alone. He underlined it once, firmly, as if sealing it into permanence. The machines still glowed softly around him, faithful and steady, but their constancy no longer offered comfort. Instead, they reminded him of his own persistence, his own refusal to let go, and the cost of carrying what no one else was willing to share. He turned one of them off for the first time, the purring device that had once soothed him in childhood. The silence it left was sharp, almost unbearable, but also honest. As the night deepened, he lay awake, eyes open to the ceiling, knowing that he was approaching a moment where the story could no longer continue as it had. Something would have to change, whether it was him, the old man, or the thread between them. And for the first time, he admitted to himself that he could not keep waiting forever. The night he left the purring machine turned off, the silence spread wider than the walls of his room. It filled the house, seeping into the spaces where sound used to live, making every footstep louder, every sigh heavier. He lay awake with the weight of it pressing down, a silence no longer born of patience but of surrender. When dawn finally arrived, the light creeping through the blinds felt foreign, as if the world outside had moved on while the house stayed trapped in its own unspoken gravity. He rose slowly, moving through the motions of the morning without intention. At the counter, the bread and wax paper waited, but he passed, then by without pause. It was not defiance anymore, not even weariness. It was clarity. The ritual had run its course, and keeping it alive felt like carrying the shadow of something already gone. He sat at the table instead, notebook open, pencil hovering above the page. For a long time, he wrote nothing. Then almost reluctantly the words came. If silence becomes the language, then I have learned it too well. He shut the notebook before the ink of the thought could settle fully, as though fearing its permanence. That evening, the old man came home later than ever. His shoulders sagged, his face drawn, and for a moment he stood in the doorway as if unsure he belonged there. The boy watched from the table, saying nothing, waiting to see if this time would be different. The old man's eyes flicked to the bare counter, lingered only a second, then shifted away. He moved past without a word, the space between them now so wide it felt like an ocean. The boy remained where he was, staring at the empty surface, realizing that the thread had not simply frayed, it had been let go. He felt it in his chest, the quiet snap of something breaking, not with drama but with inevitability. He wanted to feel anger, but what rose instead was grief, a heavy sorrow for all the lanterns he had lit, all the sandwiches he had wrapped, all the machines he had built to keep the silence at bay. None of them had been enough to hold back the unravelling. That night, the dream returned once more, but it no longer carried stars. The house was entirely dark, every room swallowed in shadow. His lantern flickered only once before going out completely, leaving him standing in a vast emptiness where walls should have been. He called out, but his voice echoed without end, no answer returning. The emptiness itself became the dream, stretching until he could no longer tell if he was asleep or awake. When he jolted upright in bed, heart pounding, he knew the dream had not been a vision of something coming. It had been the reflection of what already was. The following morning, he packed away the machines one by one. He wound their cords carefully, placed them into boxes, and stacked them neatly in the corner. Turning them off was not rejection but acceptance, a recognition that they could not fill what presence had abandoned. As the room grew quieter, he felt the sharpness of it pierce him, but also the honesty. For the first time, the silence belonged to him, not to the absence of someone else. The old man did not ask about the change. He moved through the house as before, his silence intact, his rituals broken long ago. The boy stopped waiting for questions, stopped looking for recognition in his eyes. He began to carry his notebook everywhere, filling page after page with thoughts, drawings, fragments of memory, as if archiving himself was the only way to remain tethered. Each entry was both an elegy and a seed, grief recorded alongside the faintest hint of becoming. 1. Evening. He sat at the table with the notebook open, the old man across from him, tools scattered in his hands. The boy lifted his pencil and wrote slowly, deliberately, a single line. When threads break, you can either knot them or let them fall. He did not look up, did not speak it aloud, but the truth of it pulsed through him like a heartbeat. He did not yet know which choice he would make, but he understood at last that the choice was his. And with that, the silence of the house shifted. Not brighter, not easier, but different. It was no longer only the silence of absence, it was the silence of decision, a silence heavy with the knowledge that the next step would define what remained. The silence of decision lingered like a weight in the air, pressing against him with each passing day. It did not demand urgency, yet it refused to be ignored. He felt it when he walked through the hallways of the house, when he sat at the bare counter, when he traced the lines of his notebook late at night. The thread had broken, and the question was no longer whether he could hold it. It was whether he wanted to try tying it again, or if letting it fall was the only way forward. The old man moved through his days unchanged, his silence now so familiar it felt almost deliberate, as though he had chosen to live inside it. He still repaired small objects at the table, still returned with weary shoulders and eyes that carried shadows, but he no longer looked for the boy. He existed beside him, not with him. The boy began to notice the difference more clearly now, the way their lives ran parallel, close enough to brush but never intersecting, like two paths refusing to cross. At school, He carried the same weight. His gestures of kindness continued, but without the same persistence. He no longer lingered after offering help, no longer stretched himself thin in hope of being noticed. Instead, he gave what he could and moved on, understanding now that some threads were not meant to be tied. This quiet shift startled him at first, but slowly it began to feel like relief. Presence did not need to be begged for. It either arrived willingly, or it was already gone. One evening, he sat again at the table, notebook open before him. The old man worked nearby, the faint scrape of tools filling the room. The boy wrote steadily, his pencil moving without hesitation. "I cannot repair what you will not hold with me." The words felt final, but not bitter. He glanced up then, almost unconsciously, and caught the old man's gaze for the first time in weeks. The moment was brief, only a flicker, but in it lay something the boy could not name. Regret, perhaps, or recognition. Whatever it was, it faded too quickly, swallowed by the silence that followed. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, the dream returned again, but this time the house was different. It was still dark, its rooms heavy with shadow, but in one corner a faint ember glowed. It was not the lantern he had carried before, nor the stars that once filled the ceilings. It was something smaller, humbler, a fragment of light refusing to die out. He crouched beside it, cupped his hands carefully around it, and felt warmth spread through his palms. He woke with that warmth still lingering, faint but real, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel completely hollow. The following morning, he did not prepare a sandwich. Instead, he left the counter empty on purpose, not as rebellion, but as choice. He walked past it calmly, carrying his notebook under his arm, and stepped outside into the cool air. The sky was pale, streaked with early light, and he found himself breathing more deeply than he had in weeks. He realized then that the thread he had been clutching so tightly no longer defined him. It was part of him, yes, but not the whole. When he returned home that evening, the old man was seated at the table as always, tools spread before him. The boy placed his notebook down on the opposite end, open to the page where the words still stood. When threads break, you can either knot them or let them fall. He did not speak, did not explain, but left the notebook there as he moved into his room. For once he did not wait for a response. Inside, the machines remained packed away, the rooms stripped of their hums and glows. The silence felt different now, less of an emptiness, more of a clearing. He sat at his desk with only a pencil and blank paper before him, and for the first time he began writing not about the house, not about absence, not about betrayal. He wrote about himself, about the way light had flickered, about the lanterns he had carried, about the lessons hidden in silence. The words came steadily, unbroken, as though they had been waiting all along for the space to emerge. And in the act of writing, he understood something he had not before, that the thread he could not hold with the old man did not mean there would never be another. That presence could exist elsewhere, with others who would meet it, hold it, and keep it alive. The realization did not erase the sorrow, but it softened it, turned it from a wound into a scar he could carry forward. The house was still the same, the silence still thick, but the boy no longer feared it. He had learned its language, endured its weight, and now he was beginning to speak in a voice of his own. The story had shifted, and though he did not yet know where it would lead, he knew at last that it no longer depended on someone else's hand at the other end of the thread. The days moved forward with a quiet steadiness, as if time had decided not to ask questions anymore. He no longer looked for signs of change in the old man's eyes, no longer waited for returned gestures or unfinished apologies. The ache that had once lived in his chest had folded itself into something smaller, more manageable, a low pulse rather than a wound. He still carried it, but it no longer guided his steps. What once felt like a gravity pulling him backward had become a soft shadow trailing behind. The notebook stayed open more often now, pages filling with thoughts that no longer asked for permission to be written. Some were memories, faded and fragile. Some were reflections, edges of understanding that had taken shape slowly. Others were simply words strung together to mark the fact that he was still here, still observing, still becoming. He had stopped waiting to be seen. Instead, he had learned how to witness himself. One afternoon, he walked to the end of the street where the trees swayed just enough to break the stillness. It was the kind of place where light filtered down in thin strands, warm but not overwhelming. He sat on a bench with his notebook balanced across his lap, and for the first time he began to write about the old man, not in anger, not in longing, but with a gentleness that surprised him. He wrote about the way his hands moved, careful even when tired, about the way silence sometimes wrapped around him like a coat too worn to take off. He wrote not to forgive, but to understand, and in doing so, he found a new thread. Not one they shared, but one he had chosen to carry himself. That night he returned home later than usual. The house greeted him with its familiar quiet, though it no longer felt accusatory. Just quiet. The old man sat at the table again, the same tools in front of him, the same half-finished object resting in his hands. This time the boy walked past without hesitation and placed a folded page from his notebook beside him. He didn't wait for it to be opened. He didn't need it to be. The gesture was not an invitation. It was a release. In his room, the boxes of machines remained closed, but he no longer viewed them as remnants. They were artifacts of a season, not anchors. On his desk now were only two things: his notebook and a small, glowing device he had rebuilt from parts of the old purring machine. This one didn't hum. It pulsed gently, like a breath, a reminder not of presence, but of readiness for whatever might come next. He turned it on and let the soft light spill across the desk, filling the edges of the room. Not enough to chase away shadows, but enough to see by, enough to write by. And he did. He wrote not to explain the past or predict the future, but simply to continue, to let the story unfold not in reaction to pain, but in devotion to what he could still build. Because while some threads break, others are chosen. And this one, this quiet, steady one, he had tied with his own hands. In the quiet that followed, he breathed deeply, slowly. The silence no longer pressed against him. It held him, and for the first time, he let it. The light from the rebuilt device continued its quiet pulsing through the evening, casting a steady rhythm onto the boy's desk and the walls beyond, as though the room itself had learned how to breathe. He didn't look at it much anymore, not because it had lost meaning, but because it no longer needed to prove its purpose. Its glow was not a signal, not a question. It was simply a presence, small and sure, requiring nothing in return. The old man never mentioned the folded page. Whether he read it or not remained unspoken, and that was fine. The boy had not left it behind to trigger a change or reopen the thread. They had both let go of that. He had written it for the sake of saying what he needed to say, not to be heard, not even to be remembered. Saying it had been the knot at the end of the thread. It was done. In the days that followed, he returned to his walks beneath the trees, to the soft light that filtered through them like the voice of someone kind. His notebook filled steadily, not with the weight of grief, but with the shape of thought, what it felt like to come back to oneself after long absence, what it meant to be loyal to your own quiet. He no longer filled the pages to convince himself he was still here. He wrote because he was. Back in the house, the silence between them remained, but it had transformed into something neither tender nor cruel. Just truth. The boy spoke when he needed to, but stopped offering words into a space that couldn't hold them. The old man sometimes nodded in passing, sometimes didn't. Sometimes he left tools out as if to suggest an invitation, but the boy didn't reach for them. He had already built what he needed, and it hadn't come from shared silence. It had come from what he chose to do with it. There was one evening, though, late in the season, when something shifted again. Not dramatically, not like a scene from a book where old wounds are suddenly healed, but gently, in the smallest possible way. The boy was seated at the table, not writing, just sitting. The old man entered quietly and began to repair something that looked like a lamp. His fingers moved slower now, more uncertain. One of the wires slipped from his grasp, and without speaking, the boy reached over and held it in place. They didn't speak. The repair was completed in a few minutes. When it was done, the old man gave a faint nod and pushed the lamp toward the center of the table, flipping the switch. It blinked, flickered, then lit, a soft, steady glow. The boy didn't smile. He didn't need to. He stood, left the room, and didn't look back, not out of anger, just readiness. That night, he turned the pages of his notebook back to the beginning. The earliest sketches were there, the purring machine, the silent corners, the outlines of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. The handwriting was smaller then, more careful. As he turned the pages, he noticed how the lines had grown bolder, more fluid, less hesitant. He had written his way through absence, through expectation, through the hollow spaces of near love. He had arrived here not through reunion, but through return, his own. He picked up his pencil and began to write again. Not about the house. Not about the old man. He wrote about someone who had once carried a light through a dark house, someone who had waited longer than they should have, someone who had learned that you could carry loyalty too far and that letting go wasn't a failure, it was a way forward. The words came not as confession, but as record. Not to fix what had passed, but to bless it, then keep walking. Outside, the trees swayed, the machines remained off. The silence in the house no longer stretched like a wound. It had found its edge. And the boy, now almost not a boy anymore, had too. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Pale light slipped through the windows in long, hesitant strands, brushing over surfaces with a softness that asked for nothing. The boy rose without rush, moving through the familiar rhythm of the house, not like someone caught in a pattern, but like someone who knew it by heart and had stopped being held captive by it. He brewed tea instead of coffee. The old man had always preferred coffee, but the scent no longer felt warm to him. Tea filled the air with something gentler, steam curling upward like a slow exhale, a smell that reminded him of books and quiet afternoons. He sat at the kitchen table, holding the cup loosely between both hands, and let himself feel the moment as it was. Not waiting for anything, not resisting it. The old man came into the room a while later, shoulders heavy, the corners of his eyes etched deeper than before. He didn't speak, but paused when he saw the boy at the table. There was a flicker of something unreadable, maybe recognition, maybe uncertainty. Then he moved to the counter and began assembling his usual breakfast. The silence between them was no longer thick. It had become a space where words weren't required. And in that space, the boy felt something uncoil, like tension that had held its breath for too long, finally exhaling. He reached into his notebook, not to write, but to tear out a page. Not the one about broken threads or the one about choosing silence. A different page, one with no sentence, just a single-line sketch of a hand reaching out, not clasping anything, not offering anything, just open. He folded it once and left it on the table between them when he stood to leave the room. The old man looked down at it slowly and didn't touch it, but he didn't ignore it either. Outside, the boy let the air fill his lungs in a way that felt deliberate. The world beyond the house had always been there, but today it felt available. Not calling to him, not asking, but open. He walked with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove to the past. The notebook stayed under his arm, but it felt lighter now, less like a ledger, more like a trail of breadcrumbs he could choose to follow or leave behind. The day unfolded without weight. He wandered farther than usual, past the familiar trees, across streets where strangers moved without noticing him. He liked it that way, unnoticed but unburdened. He sat on a bench outside the small library he used to visit and opened the notebook again. This time he didn't draw or write immediately. He just flipped through the pages one by one, letting them speak for themselves. He paused on a page he had forgotten, a drawing of a lantern, scribbled roughly, uneven light spilling from its base. At the time, he had drawn it after one of the dreams, after the darkness had almost swallowed the house. But now he saw something else in it, not the fear, but the fact that the light had still been drawn. Even when he couldn't see anything clearly, he had chosen to draw light. He smiled, just slightly. It wasn't joy, not entirely, but it was real, and real was enough. When he returned home, the house felt smaller than before, not in size, but in hold. The silence didn't press against him now. It simply existed, like background noise from a life he'd already begun to step beyond. The old man was still at the table, staring out the window. The folded page was gone. They didn't speak. But when the boy passed by, the old man's hand lifted slightly from the table and settled again, a movement so subtle it could have meant anything. But the boy took it as it was, neither apology nor invitation, only presence, and that at last was enough. In his room, the device on his desk pulsed gently. He turned it off for the final time, not out of rejection but of closure. Some lights aren't meant to burn forever. Some are just meant to lead you out of the dark. He placed the machine gently into the box with the others and pushed it beneath his desk. That night, for the first time, he wrote nothing. He didn't need to. The words would come again when they were ready. For now, the quiet held him, not as absence, not as loss, but as space. And in that space, he slept. Morning returned with a familiar softness, a pale wash of light climbing the walls as if reluctant to disturb anything. He stirred slowly, not from urgency, but from quiet readiness. There was no tension in the air, no lingering trace of unresolved words waiting in the corners of the room, just the hush of a house still intact, still standing, and, for the first time in a long time, not demanding anything from him. He didn't open the notebook, not because there was nothing to write, but because for once there was nothing that needed writing. The thoughts that had once raced through him with the urgency of survival now moved like slow rivers, still present, still deep, but no longer turbulent. He dressed without thinking, sipped his tea without rush, and passed through the hallway with the ease of someone no longer measuring every silence. The old man was in the kitchen when he entered, seated in the same chair as always. The table had been cleared, and for the first time in weeks the tools were nowhere in sight. In their place sat two mugs, side by side, already steeping in silence. One was his, the other offered. He paused, only briefly, then sat. The tea was still hot. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air between them had shifted, not into forgiveness, not into closeness, but into recognition, an understanding that what had broken would not be mended, but it would also not be ignored. And perhaps that was all that was possible. The boy looked out the window. Morning moved in slow layers, light through branches, wind over rooftops, shadows rising like breath. He realized then that the story they had lived together, fractured, looping, aching, was not something to escape or erase. It had shaped him. Quietly, relentlessly, it had taught him to listen to what wasn't said, to read presence from gestures rather than promises. It had given him silence, and from that silence he had made meaning. They finished their tea in the same slow rhythm. When the boy stood, the old man did not follow, but his eyes lifted and held his for a second longer than usual. There was no message there, no plea, just the simple presence of someone who had nothing left to give, but also perhaps nothing more to take. That was enough. Outside, the street had warmed. Children's voices echoed from somewhere nearby, high, bright, careless. The boy walked in no particular direction, just far enough to feel the shift of air against his face. He had no need to carry anything with him, not the notebook, not the machines, not even the questions. He had outgrown the house without leaving it. At a corner bench he liked, he sat and let the breeze turn his thoughts over, not backward, not forward, just here. He thought of the thread again, not as something broken, but as something complete. It had run its length. It had done what it was meant to do. Now, if something new was to be tied, it would not begin from survival. It would begin from choice. He stayed there until the sun had risen fully and the morning became day. Then he stood quietly and walked on, not toward anything, not away from anything, just forward, still becoming, still here, still whole. The path forward didn't look different. Same cracked sidewalks, same tree roots nudging up from beneath, same flicker of birds darting across fences. But it felt different. There was no longer that quiet pull in his chest, no tension like thread caught on a nail behind him. What had needed to be said had been said, or accepted in silence, and what remained now was only what he chose to carry. He walked past the library and the little corner shop that smelled of old paper and cinnamon, the one he used to pass without noticing. Today, he paused there, just long enough to see how the morning sunlight warmed the window panes, casting dust motes in slow orbits. Inside, someone laughed. Lightly, easily, and he found himself smiling, not at the sound itself, but at the ease of it. There was no destination. He let his feet take him wherever they wanted, and they led him toward the small park with its worn benches and quiet pond. He had come here as a child once or twice, with hands sticky from melted ice cream, the old man trailing a few steps behind, always pretending not to hover. That memory returned now, soft and unfocused, not painful, just worn, like fabric touched too many times. He sat beneath a tree where the bark peeled like weathered paper and tilted his face to the canopy above. The wind rustled the leaves without urgency, and through that scattered rhythm he felt something gentle threading back through him, not a reconnection to what had broken, but to something older, quieter, the self that had existed before he knew how to carry silence for someone else. The pages of his mind, once filled with trying to understand another person's absences, had begun to clear, not erase, just settle. The things that had happened in the house, the long silences, the rituals, the fading, none of it needed to be rewritten. It was real. It had shaped him. But it was no longer writing over him. He leaned back, let his thoughts drift. A dog barked somewhere far off. A child shouted, then laughed. Life, messy and unscripted, unspooled around him, and for the first time he didn't feel separate from it. He had always imagined that healing would look like a conversation, a moment of return, a repair. But maybe it was this instead, the quiet relief of realizing you no longer needed the answer to keep living. He stayed there as the sky shifted toward afternoon, letting time pass without asking anything of it. Eventually he rose, stretched and started home, not because he needed to return, but because he could. The walk back was easy. The house looked the same from the outside, but it no longer felt like the center of the story. It was just one place he had been, one place he had learned something difficult and necessary. Inside, the old man was in the living room, the television humming low. The boy passed through quietly, nodding once. The old man looked up, met his eyes, and though he didn't smile, he didn't look away. The nod he gave in return was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Not a promise, not a new beginning, just a shared moment in the present, clean of weight. In his room, the box of machines remained under the desk. The notebook was still there too, its pages full, its binding worn soft from use. He didn't need to open it. He knew what was inside. He sat down, not to build or write, but simply to be still. The light moved slowly across the floor, and for a while he watched it, and then, like something quiet clicking into place, he breathed, not just in, not just out, but through. Evening fell slowly, like the gentle folding of a soft blanket over the world. The boy remained in his room a while longer, letting the quiet stretch across the walls and floor, letting it settle into his chest in a way that didn't feel like absence or burden, but like a pause. He thought of all the rituals that had shaped him, the sandwiches, the glowing, machines, the quiet sketches, and for the first time he felt the weight of them ease. They were part of him, but they no longer defined him. He stood and moved to the window, pressing his hands lightly to the glass. The neighborhood was calm, shadows lengthening into shapes that suggested stories, but did not demand answers. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, laughter rose and fell, pure and unmeasured. He realized he no longer had to interpret or hold the weight of everything around him. The world existed outside his control, and that was not frightening. That was freedom. The old man's presence in the house had become a quiet companion rather than a tether. He moved through rooms, worked with tools, or sat silently in the living room, and the boy no longer waited for acknowledgement, no longer expected patterns to repeat. Their existence together was a kind of equilibrium now, not dependent on rituals or attention. They were simply sharing the same space, breathing in the same air, each carrying their own quiet truths. Later, The boy picked up his notebook and traced his fingers across the pages filled with sketches, words, fragments of memory. He paused on the earliest pages, the drawings of the purring machine and the lanterns. He smiled softly, seeing the trajectory of his own growth. What had once felt like a weight pressing from every side now felt like a map, a record of survival, of learning, of becoming. Each line and word carried the proof that he had endured, that he had noticed, that he had chosen persistence and, ultimately, release. The night deepened. He opened the window just enough to feel the air, cool and steady, brushing against his face. He thought of the lanterns that had guided him, the quiet gestures that had shaped him, and the silences that had taught him patience. None of it had been wasted. Every absence, every unspoken word, every small act of care had formed the contour of who he had become. And now, standing there, he felt the soft certainty that he could step forward without needing anyone else to carry the thread. In the kitchen, the old man was stirring something quietly, the light from the lamp falling in a narrow strip across the counter. The boy glanced back once, catching the movement, and nodded softly. No words were needed. Presence at last had found its form, not in the acts themselves, but in the awareness that they no longer needed to be returned to hold value. He returned to his desk, closed the notebook, and let his hands rest upon it. Outside, the moon rose, pale and patient, tracing silver lines across the neighborhood. The boy leaned back in his chair, breathing slowly, deliberately, feeling the rhythm of the night pulse through him. The world remained uncertain and alive, and he was ready to meet it, not as someone holding onto threads others might snap, but as someone who had learned how to walk forward alone and unafraid. And as the house settled around him, quiet but unbroken, he let his eyes close for the first time in many nights, knowing that the story he carried, both the one lived and the one imagined, was his own to keep. The silence no longer pressed. It embraced. The night stretched on, slow and deep, its quiet settling into every corner of the house. The boy, now more fully himself, let the stillness hold him, letting it press against his shoulders without weighing him down. He could feel the pulse of the world outside, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car, a dog's bark fading into the dark, and it no longer demanded his attention. He had learned how to let life move alongside him without tethering himself to its every motion. He rose from his desk, the notebook closed and resting beside him, and walked to the window. The moonlight lay in soft bands across the floor, highlighting the gentle slope of the table, the quieted machines, the traces of past rituals. Everything he had built, everything he had held existed now as memory and artifact rather than expectation. He could see it, acknowledge it, and let it be. The old man moved in the living room, stirring quietly, the only sound the faint scrape of his hands across the table. The boy did not move toward him, did not speak. He simply watched, understanding fully that the connection they shared had shifted. It was no longer a thread to clutch, but a presence to recognize. Later he returned to his desk, but not to write. He rested his hands on the surface, letting them feel the worn edges of the notebook, the empty spaces where machines had once hummed. For a long while, he simply sat, letting thoughts drift in and out without effort, allowing the weight of the past and the lightness of release to exist side by side. There was no need for answers, no urgency for reconciliation. He was learning the language of patience, of quiet endurance without expectation. As midnight deepened, he allowed himself to recall the earliest days, the purring machine, the sandwiches, the long silences, the waiting. Each memory pressed against him softly, a reminder of growth, of perseverance, of the strength it takes to carry absence and still move forward. And he understood something new, that love, care, and presence are not measured by reciprocity alone. They exist in the act itself, in the intention behind it, and the courage to continue when nothing is returned. He stood and moved the small lamp at the edge of his desk, turning it on. Its glow was soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to illuminate the notebook and the surface around it. The light did not demand attention, did not assert itself. It merely existed. He watched it for a long moment, recognizing it as a reflection of himself, steady, unassuming, resilient. Finally, he lay back in his chair, closing his eyes. The house breathed around him, familiar, yet transformed. The old man's quiet presence was no longer a weight, no longer an expectation, but part of the landscape through which he moved. The past had left its marks and the future remained unwritten, but he felt a calm certainty settling in. He had learned how to endure, how to recognize absence without being defined by it, how to carry loyalty without being bound to its return. And somewhere in that stillness, he felt the first faint promise of morning, soft, patient, inevitable. The world would continue, full of uncertainty and light, and he would meet it as himself, whole, steady, and quietly ready. Morning arrived in the way it always had, gradual, unhurried, softening the edges of the night, but now it carried a sense of clarity he had not felt before. The boy rose from his chair, stretched, and let the sunlight spill across the room, touching the notebook, the desk, the quiet corners where the machines had once hummed. The house held its familiar contours, but he moved through it differently now, lighter in his step, aware that the weight he had carried for so long no longer defined him. He passed through the kitchen, noting the old man at the table. There were no words, no rituals, no expectations hanging between them. The old man's presence was simple, factual, like a constant in the background of a shifting equation. For the first time he realized that he did not need acknowledgement, did not need reciprocity to understand the value of what had been shared. Presence could exist without applause, and care could exist without proof. He stepped outside, letting the morning air fill his lungs fully, deliberately. The world beyond the house was vibrant and unclaimed. The trees swayed gently, birds darted through the open sky, and somewhere nearby a child laughed, utterly unmeasured and free. He walked slowly, feeling the rhythm of his own feet against the pavement, noticing the way light struck the edges of leaves, the way shadows bent across familiar paths. For the first time he felt part of it, not as someone tethered by absence nor as someone burdened by expectation, but simply present. He carried the notebook under his arm but did not open it. He did not need to record, to explain, or to remember anything. The act of walking, the act of observing, was enough. He let his thoughts drift, unshaped, not needing resolution. The memories of sandwiches, glowing machines, long silences, and frayed threads floated in the edges of his mind. But they no longer pressed against him. They were lessons now, folded gently into the core of himself. At the corner park he had often visited, he paused beneath the same peeling tree bark, letting the light filter through the canopy. The pond reflected a sky stripped clean of worry, the water holding only what it must. He closed his eyes briefly and felt the air move through him, carrying a quiet steadiness. For years he had measured absence, endurance, and loyalty as though they were threads to clutch. Now he understood them differently, as currents in which he could swim, neither grasping nor being swept away. When he returned home, the house greeted him with its familiar hush, but it no longer felt suffocating. He noticed the old man stirring at the table again, but he did not approach. He passed by calmly, leaving a faint nod in his wake. The old man looked up, caught the motion, and returned it. No words were exchanged, but acknowledgement lingered in the small gesture, neither heavy nor demanding. In his room, the notebook lay open, filled with sketches and sentences that had once held the weight of survival and patience. He ran his fingers across the pages, feeling the contours of the journey, understanding that the story he carried was no longer just about endurance or waiting. It was about recognition, about the ability to continue, about learning how to hold one's own light steady in the world, without relying on someone else to carry it for you. He set the notebook down, leaving it closed. The boxes of machines remained under the desk, silent, their purpose fulfilled. He sat in the chair, letting the quiet fold around him, not as absence, not as emptiness, but as space. Space for what would come next, for what he would choose to build, for the life he would step into fully aware and unafraid. And somewhere in the stillness, he allowed himself the simplest thought he had carried in months. He was ready. The world awaited, uncertain and alive, and he would meet it exactly as he was. The afternoon sun moved lazily across the walls, softening the edges of shadows that had once felt too sharp to ignore. He walked through the house slowly, taking in every familiar corner with a sense of awareness that was calm rather than urgent. The rooms no longer pressed against him with expectation. Instead, they existed alongside him, quiet witnesses to a life he had slowly begun to claim for himself. He paused by the window overlooking the street, noticing the movement below. Neighbours tending gardens, a child kicking a ball, an old dog wandering with deliberate steps. Life flowed without ceremony, without asking him to measure it, and in that observation he felt a quiet gratitude settle deep in his chest. It was the understanding that presence was not something one demanded or waited for. It was something one noticed, accepted, and allowed to exist alongside oneself. The old man sat at the table, hands folded around a cup of tea. He made no gesture to speak, and the boy did not offer one. Their shared silence was no longer heavy. It was neutral, almost neutral enough to feel like companionship without dependency. He walked past and left the kitchen quietly, feeling for the first time that he could move through the house unburdened by expectation or ritual. In his room, he opened the notebook once more. The pages were thick with sketches, half-written sentences and fragments of thought. But today, he didn't pick up the pencil to continue the same lines. Instead, he allowed himself to simply sit and reflect, letting the quiet of the house and the warmth of the light settle around him. He traced a finger along the pages, remembering the nights filled with the purring machine, the sandwiches, the small acts of persistence that had once kept him tethered to hope. None of it felt wasted. All of it had led to this sense of grounded stillness, a presence not dependent on anyone else. Outside, the light shifted as clouds moved across the sky, painting the streets in soft patches of shade. He watched for a long while, letting each movement sink in. He understood now that life's rhythm was not something to control, but something to step into, aware and deliberate. The world did not demand his endurance anymore. He could choose when to act, when to wait, and when simply to be. He returned to the desk and placed his hands flat on the surface. The machines under the desk remained off, their purpose fulfilled. He could hear the faint hum of life in the house itself, the settling of the walls, the quiet tick of a clock, the far-off sound of the refrigerator. Each small sound reminded him that, even in absence, life continued, and he could continue alongside it without fear. The sun lowered, scattering long, golden streaks across the floor. He rose, stretched, and moved to the window again. The neighborhood had grown quieter as the day waned, but the world was still alive, still moving forward, still offering space to step into. He felt the pulse of it beneath his hands on the windowsill, beneath his feet on the floor, and he recognized that his own pulse was steady now, in rhythm with it. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine the days ahead without clinging to rituals, without waiting for acknowledgement, without measuring silence as a gauge of worth. He could act, observe, and exist, simply because he was here, because he had learned to carry his own light, and because he was capable of moving forward unafraid. And in that realization, he breathed fully, deliberately, letting the stillness and the motion of the world mingle. The house no longer held him captive. It was a home, yes, but also a witness, and he, finally, was ready to move through it and beyond it, as himself. The evening deepened, stretching shadows across the walls with a slow, unhurried patience. He moved through the house with measured steps, noticing details he had once overlooked. The faint curve of the doorframe, the gentle slope of the floorboard near the window, the way light lingered along the edges of the old table. Each small observation carried weight now, not because it demanded attention, but because he had learned how to be present for it. He paused at the counter, glancing at the space where sandwiches had once been laid with care. The act no longer held power. It was a memory, a lesson, a trace of patience given and persistence offered. He didn't dwell on absence or expectation. Instead, he simply acknowledged what had been without judgment and moved past it. The house had shifted with him. Its silence, no longer pressed. It had softened into accompaniment, as if the walls themselves had learned to watch without demanding. In his room, the notebook lay open on the desk, its pages thick with sketches, words, and fragments of thought. He sat down and traced a finger over the lines he had drawn long ago, over the edges of lanterns, machines, and corners he had mapped in careful memory. Each line spoke of endurance and quiet observation. He didn't need to add more. The act of reflection alone was enough, the proof that he had carried what mattered and learned how to release what could not be held. Outside, the sky dimmed into twilight, stretching the day into a long, gentle sigh. He stood at the window, watching the world move, cars passing in muted rhythm, trees swaying lightly, distant voices fading. It occurred to him that life existed whether or not he measured it, and that he could exist alongside it without holding it in his hands. Presence could be given, but it did not have to be demanded or stored. The old man moved quietly in the living room, hands folded for a moment before he returned to a small task, perhaps repairing something long overlooked. Their eyes met briefly, and this time there was no expectation on either side. Just recognition, a subtle acknowledgement that the space between them had been travelled, that the past had been carried, and that both could now simply be in the same house without grasping for connection. He walked back to his desk and closed the notebook softly. The machines remained under the desk, silent and unneeded. The glow of the lamp at the edge of his desk filled the room with gentle light, not harsh or demanding, just present. He let himself lean back, breathing slowly, deliberately, aware of the pulse of the world outside, the stillness within, and the quiet certainty that he could move forward without tether or expectation. And as night settled fully, he allowed himself to feel the weight of all that had been carried ease slightly from his shoulders. The journey of waiting, of enduring, of observing, had brought him here, not to resolution, not to triumph, but to understanding. He closed his eyes and let the house, the night, and the past fold around him, knowing that he was ready to meet whatever came next, with calm steadiness and his own quiet light guiding the way. The first hints of morning seeped slowly into the room, pale and deliberate, brushing over the notebook and the edges of the lamp's glow. He stirred without urgency, letting the quiet coat his shoulders like a familiar garment. Today felt different, not because anything had changed outwardly, but because something inside him had shifted. The thread he had carried for so long, the one that had tied him to absence, endurance, and expectation, had finally loosened. He could feel the space around it, open and unpressured. He rose and moved through the house with a steady calm, noticing small details he had once overlooked. The way a window latch caught the light, the faint spiral of dust motes in the sunbeam, the low creak of the floorboard under the old man's careful steps. The house breathed around him, neither demanding nor ignoring, simply existing. He let it be, and in doing so, he allowed himself to be. At the kitchen counter, the space was empty as it had been for weeks. He did not pause, did not measure the absence. Instead, he poured a glass of water, letting the simplicity of the act feel enough. Across the room, the old man moved quietly, performing small, habitual tasks. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time there was no expectation, no tension, just a gentle recognition, a shared acknowledgement of two lives moving through the same space, neither dependent on the other. The boy returned to his desk, notebook in hand, and ran his fingers across the pages, tracing the lines and words he had left behind. He paused at a sketch of a lantern. The graphite faded but deliberate, and felt a quiet resonance. It had guided him through darkness before, and now its significance was different. Not a tool to illuminate absence, but a reminder of his own steady presence. He did not need to add new sketches or sentences. The act of remembering, of reflecting, was sufficient. Outside, the morning light deepened. He walked to the window, letting the day pull gently at him. The neighborhood stirred softly, and he noticed small rhythms in the world. The sway of tree branches, the distant call of a bird, the low hum of life unfolding without notice. He understood now that presence existed, whether it was recognized or not, and that he could move within it without grasping or measuring. Later, he stepped outside, carrying nothing, and let the air fill him. He wandered slowly, letting the familiar streets and the shifting light remind him that the world continued in quiet patience, and he too could continue, steady, aware, unburdened. He stopped at the small park with its worn benches and tilted trees, feeling the weight of everything he had endured begin to lift. The past, the absence, the long threads of patience and expectation, they had all led him here, and here he was ready simply to exist, observing and participating without demand, without clutching, without waiting. As the day settled into afternoon, he returned home, moving through the rooms with deliberate calm. The old man remained at the table, quietly occupied. The boy passed by, nodding once in acknowledgement. The old man's gaze met his briefly, a silent exchange, neither heavy nor urgent, just the quiet acknowledgement that each had survived, each had persisted, and each could now move forward within the same space without burden. He returned to his desk, sat down, and let the sunlight spill over the notebook, the closed machines, the edges of the lamp. He breathed fully, slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of the past ease and the quiet strength of his own presence settle in. The house, the day, and the world continued around him, but he was no longer waiting, no longer tethered. He was simply here, whole, ready, and unafraid to meet whatever came next. The afternoon sun waned, folding itself into long, gentle streaks that painted the walls with gold and amber. He remained at his desk, hands resting on the notebook but not moving, letting the quiet of the house settle into him. The stillness was no longer oppressive. It was a companion, steady and forgiving. He could feel the journey behind him, the weight of absence, the endurance of ritual, the lessons of patience, and it no longer pressed him down. It existed as part of the rhythm of his own steady heartbeat. The old man moved quietly through the kitchen, arranging things with a calmness that matched the day. Their eyes met briefly as the boy stood and walked past, but there was no expectation, no need to measure gestures or words. The thread that had once bound them in quiet tension had transformed into something softer, something unspoken, yet acknowledged, the simple fact of coexistence, a presence that required nothing more than recognition. Outside, the world carried on without ceremony. Leaves rustled gently in the wind, birds shifted across branches, and somewhere, children's laughter rose and fell, light and unmeasured. He stepped outside, feeling the air brush against his skin, and let the rhythm of life move alongside him. He didn't measure or hold it, only allowed himself to exist within it, fully aware, yet unbound. He walked slowly, without destination, tracing the familiar streets with a sense of quiet intention. The notebook remained at his side, closed, holding its pages like a past that had shaped him, but no longer dictated his path. He paused at the corner park, the same one he had often visited, and looked around at the tilting trees, the worn benches, the small pond catching the fading light. He realized that the world was full of presence that required no obligation, that care existed even when unreturned, and that endurance was not measured by how long one held on, but by the courage to continue despite absence. Returning home, he moved through the rooms with a newfound lightness. The old man remained seated, hands folded, absorbed in his own quiet tasks. The boy passed by and offered a small nod, an acknowledgement that carried no weight of expectation. The old man returned the gesture briefly, and for the first time in many years, there was no tension, no history pressing against the moment. Just simple, steady recognition. In his room, he sat at the desk once more, letting the sunlight spill across the closed notebook and the quiet machines beneath it. He breathed fully, deliberately, feeling the lessons of the past integrate into the fabric of his own being. There was no need for rituals, for waiting, for proving. Presence, care, and understanding had become self-contained, steady within him, no longer dependent on others to sustain. As evening deepened, he leaned back in his chair, eyes resting on the fading light through the window. The world continued its gentle rhythm outside, and he felt at ease, fully present and aware. The house, once heavy with absence, now carried only quiet companionship, and somewhere, in the soft folds of the day's ending, he allowed himself to rest fully, knowing that he had reached a space of balance, of presence, and of quiet readiness to meet whatever would come next. He exhaled slowly, letting the last weight of expectation fall away. The past had shaped him, the present held him steady, and the future waited, unhurried, open, and alive. The night deepened outside the window, gentle and unhurried, carrying with it a quiet that felt neither empty nor oppressive. He remained at his desk, the notebook closed but warm beneath his hands, feeling the rhythm of the day settle into the contours of the room. The world outside whispered softly, the distant rustle of leaves, the faint hum of a passing car, the occasional call of a night bird, and he felt each sound as a reminder that life moved forward, patiently and without demand. He rose slowly and walked to the window, pressing his hands lightly against the cool glass. The street below lay calm, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It struck him how much had changed in the space of his own perception. Where once absence had pressed heavily against his chest, now it existed simply as a quiet backdrop, neither threatening nor needing attention. He was aware, fully present, and no longer tethered by the weight of what could not be returned. The old man remained in the living room, absorbed in some small task, his hands moving with careful patience. The boy did not approach. There was no expectation, no need for acknowledgement. Their coexistence had shifted into a rhythm of quiet mutual awareness, a presence that did not demand action or response. And in this unspoken understanding, the boy recognized a freedom he had not known before, the freedom of carrying his own light without requiring it to be reflected back. He returned to the desk and allowed himself to lean back in the chair, eyes tracing the shadows as they stretched across the room. The machines beneath the desk remained silent, their purpose fulfilled long ago, yet they seemed to hum faintly in memory, echoes of the care and attention he had once poured into them. He let the memory wash over him without clinging, letting each act of persistence transform into a quiet affirmation of his own presence. Time moved slowly, folding in layers of sound and shadow. He thought briefly of the early days, the rituals, the sandwiches, the long nights filled with the quiet pulse of machines, and the subtle absence of acknowledgement. Each memory was no longer a weight, but a thread woven into the fabric of who he had become, marking the way he had learned to endure, to observe, and ultimately to release. Stepping away from the desk, he moved to the window once more, gazing out at the night. The world was full of movement, small and measured, entirely unaware of the quiet transformation within him. He felt a sense of readiness settle deep in his chest, a calm certainty that he could meet the unfolding days without clutching, without waiting, and without needing permission to exist fully in the space he occupied. And in that stillness, he allowed himself to close his eyes. The house breathed around him, familiar, yet light, the night folding in soft layers, carrying the quiet assurance that what had been endured, observed and released would remain with him as he stepped into the days ahead. For the first time in a long while, he felt unshakably present, entirely whole, and quietly ready for whatever came next. The night stretched quietly into the early hours, a gentle hush settling over the house. He remained by the window, letting the faint moonlight spill across the floor, tracing the familiar lines of the room with soft clarity. The silence was no longer heavy or expectant. It felt like a companion, steady and forgiving. He allowed himself to breathe slowly, feeling the rhythm of the night synchronize with the beat of his own pulse, steady and unhurried. He rose, moving carefully through the room, observing details that had once gone unnoticed, the subtle curve of the desk edge, the faint scuff marks on the floor where years of footsteps had passed, the soft play of light on the walls. Each detail was a reminder that the house was alive with its own rhythm, independent of expectation or demand, and he too existed within that rhythm, fully present, unbound. The old man moved through the living room, hands busy with a small task, careful and deliberate. Their eyes met briefly as the boy passed, a silent acknowledgement exchanged, neither seeking nor offering more. It was a subtle rhythm of coexistence that required no words. The boy felt a quiet satisfaction in this understanding, the unspoken recognition that they could occupy the same space without the past pressing down upon them. He returned to his desk, hands resting on the notebook, tracing the worn edges without writing. The pages held memories, lessons, and fragments of endurance. He allowed himself to reflect, not to add, not to correct, but simply to recognize the journey he had traversed, the long nights of waiting, the silent rituals, the machines humming softly in memory. Each element had shaped him, but none dictated his present. He was his own measure now, steady and intentional. Stepping away from the desk, he moved toward the window again, looking out over the quiet street. Life flowed beyond the glass, trees swaying in the gentle breeze, distant sounds of cars and voices, the occasional bird calling softly. He absorbed it without judgment, without effort. It existed. He existed. That was enough. He understood now that presence, care, and understanding were not contingent on others, that he could meet the world with his own light steady, regardless of reflection or recognition. The house remained calm, shadows stretching and receding with the subtle shift of moonlight. He felt the weight of the past ease from his chest, leaving only the soft certainty of readiness. The threads that had once bound him to expectation and absence had been untangled, leaving space for clarity, for choice, and for quiet strength. He sat again, allowing the room, the house, and the night to fold around him. The notebook rested closed on the desk, the machines silent beneath it, and the lamp at the edge of the table cast a gentle glow. He let himself exist fully in that moment, neither clinging nor reaching, simply present. And somewhere in that stillness he realized that the journey of endurance, patience, and observation had not ended. It had transformed. He was no longer holding on. He was stepping forward, carrying his own light, aware, ready, and quietly unafraid of whatever would come next. The morning arrived with a quiet certainty, soft light slipping through the blinds and spreading across the desk where the notebook rested. He rose slowly, feeling the rhythm of his own breathing steady and sure. The house, familiar and unchanged in form, no longer carried the weight of expectation. It existed alongside him, neither pressing nor demanding, and for the first time he could move through it fully aware, yet unburdened. He walked past the kitchen counter, empty as it had been for weeks. The old man stirred in the living room, hands occupied with a small task, absorbed and calm. Their eyes met briefly, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them. No words were exchanged, no gestures demanded, only the quiet recognition that each had survived, endured, and arrived at a space where coexistence required neither explanation nor ritual. The boy felt a soft, steady warmth at the edges of his awareness, an acceptance of the present without clinging to what had been or hoping for what might come. Stepping outside, he let the morning air fill him. The world beyond the house was alive and unscripted, leaves rustling in the breeze, distant voices carrying laughter, sunlight glinting off a passing car. He walked slowly, absorbing each detail, letting it flow around him instead of pressing inward. For the first time he felt the pulse of life as something to move with rather than something to measure, the rhythm of the streets and trees harmonizing with the calm within him. He paused at the corner park, the familiar bench under the tilting tree. The pond shimmered softly in the morning light, reflecting the sky's pale blue and the subtle motion of clouds. He leaned against the tree trunk, notebook still closed under his arm, and allowed himself to simply be present. There was no need to record, no need to measure, no need to chase. Presence itself, steady and unobtrusive, was enough. Returning home, he moved through the rooms with ease, noticing details he had once overlooked. The gentle sway of the curtains, the faint creak of the floorboards, the muted reflection of sunlight across the old table. Everything felt alive, not because it demanded attention, but because it existed in its own quiet rhythm. He had learned to move alongside it without trying to control or hold it. In his room, he placed the notebook gently on the desk and sat back, eyes resting on the edges of the lamp's soft glow. The machines beneath the desk remained silent, their purpose fulfilled long ago. He let the quiet settle fully around him, feeling the arc of the journey, the waiting, the patience, the rituals, the lessons of absence, integrate into a sense of calm completeness. The house breathed softly, the world outside humming faintly in its own rhythm, and he let himself close his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he did not cling, did not measure, did not wait. He simply existed, aware, steady, and quietly ready. The evening settled with a gentle hush, drawing long shadows across the floor and softening the edges of the familiar room. He remained at his desk for a while, letting the quiet stretch around him like a slow, deliberate tide. The notebook lay closed, machines dormant, and the house itself seemed to breathe in tandem with his own rhythm. There was a stillness that felt earned, a sense of balance between the past and the present, absence and presence, patience and understanding. He rose slowly, moving to the window, pressing his hands lightly against the cool glass. The street below was calm, the wind tracing patterns through the branches of the trees, carrying distant laughter and the low hum of life unfolding without expectation. He watched without judgment, letting the world exist alongside him rather than imposing himself upon it. For the first time, he felt fully integrated with the rhythm of his surroundings, aware but unbound. The old man moved through the living room quietly, absorbed in a small task, yet present enough that their shared silence no longer carried tension. Their eyes met once, brief and unspoken, a recognition of coexistence rather than need. He nodded softly, a gesture met with the faintest return. No words, no rituals, no expectation, only acknowledgement of being in the same moment, fully, without demand. He stepped outside, letting the cool air brush across his face. The neighborhood was alive in subtle ways, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bird call, the muted footsteps of neighbors. He walked slowly, breathing deliberately, noticing the way the sunlight touched the pavements and walls, how the shadows shifted as the day folded toward night. He did not chase or measure these details. He allowed them to exist, appreciating them as part of a larger rhythm he was learning to move with rather than against. At the small park he had often visited, he paused beneath the familiar tilting tree, the bench sun-warmed and welcoming. He sat and let his thoughts drift, acknowledging the past without letting it bind him. The long nights of waiting, the silent sandwiches, the humming machines, all of it had led him here, to a quiet understanding of endurance, of presence, of the gentle power in observing life without demanding reciprocity. Returning home, he moved through the rooms with ease, noticing the subtle details that had once felt unnoticed, the sway of curtains, the soft creak of the floorboards, the muted reflections of light across tables and walls. He realized that life existed in these small motions, and so did he, not as someone tethered, not as someone waiting, but as someone fully inhabiting the space he moved through. In his room, he sat at the desk, hands resting lightly on the closed notebook. The machines remained under the desk, silent but significant, artifacts of a past season of learning. He let the quiet settle fully, feeling the journey, the patience, the endurance, the lessons in absence integrate into him. He closed his eyes and leaned back, feeling the room, the house, and the world outside fold gently around him. No expectations, no waiting, no tethering, only awareness, presence, and the steady certainty that he could move forward in his own light, quietly ready for whatever came next. Night deepened with a softness that seemed to fold the house in its own gentle rhythm. He remained at his desk for a while longer, letting the calm settle over him like a familiar coat. The notebook lay closed, the machines beneath silent, their purpose fulfilled long ago, and the house itself breathed alongside him, steady and unhurried. He felt the quiet pulse of life, inside and outside, past and present, interweaving into something whole and unmistakably his. He rose slowly, moving to the window, pressing his hands lightly against the cool glass. The street below carried only the faintest echoes of movement, The distant hum of cars, a dog wandering at a neighbour's fence, the subtle rustle of leaves stirred by a passing breeze. None of it demanded him, none of it required recognition, and in that stillness he felt the profound relief of knowing he too could exist fully without expectation, without tether, without needing to hold anything that was not his to carry. The old man moved quietly through the living room, hands absorbed in some small task. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time he felt no pull to measure the moment, no burden of trying to interpret gesture or glance. The acknowledgement hung there, quiet, steady, sufficient. Presence could exist without ceremony, care could exist without articulation, and he could exist within both, fully and without apology. He stepped outside into the night air, letting it brush across his face, letting the world move around him without trying to hold it in place. The neighbourhood stretched familiar, yet distant, shadows bending in their soft rhythms, distant lights flickering gently. He walked slowly, deliberately, noticing the arcs of light on walls, the sway of trees, the small pulse of life that continued beyond himself. He did not record, did not measure, did not wait. He simply observed and existed, fully aligned with the rhythm of what was, and content to let it flow. At the small park he had often visited, he paused beneath the tilting tree, sitting on the worn bench. The pond mirrored the sky, the fading moonlight, the subtle movement of branches above. He leaned back, letting the wind trace the edges of his awareness, and allowed the quiet to fill him. The endurance, the patience, the long nights of waiting and observing, the rituals of sandwiches and humming machines, all of it had brought him here, to a moment of clarity where he could simply be. Returning home, he moved through the house with ease, noticing familiar shapes and sounds in a new light, the sway of curtains, the soft creak of floorboards, the muted reflection of lamplight on the old table. The journey of observation and endurance had taught him to inhabit this space fully, without relying on the acknowledgement or participation of anyone else. In his room he returned to the desk and rested his hands lightly upon the closed notebook. The machines remained silent beneath, reminders of a chapter concluded. He leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet fold around him, steady and complete. Outside, the night moved slowly, rhythmically, like a living pulse. He exhaled deeply, the weight of expectation lifted, the thread of presence no longer necessary to carry, and somewhere in that soft darkness, he allowed himself the simplest realization. He was whole. Not tethered, not waiting, not holding. Just here, fully present, aware and ready to step into whatever came next with his own steady light guiding the way, and with that he stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.